Hello, everyone. Are we live yet?
Apparently we're live, I'm being told in the room.
Great. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Bruegel's annual meeting. This is the panel on EU digital strategy at a time of geopolitical stress, and I'm your moderator. Interestingly, I'm not at Bruegel today. I'm calling in from Bonn. One of the speakers, Alberto Di Felice, is in Bonn. So I think in these days of the pandemic, we all have to be a little flexible. Now, we've got some superb panelists today, but before turning over to them, I'd like to make some brief remarks to help structure our discussion for today, and also to put it in the context of the previous sessions at the Bruegel annual meeting. In yesterday's opening session, Tharman Shanmugaratnam, Senior Minister of Singapore, made some very thoughtful comments. He noted that policymakers today face a very challenging task. They have to deal, on the one hand, with the enormous challenges that the pandemic poses, but they also have to address a great many additional challenges that were already festering long before the pandemic hit. And they have to do all of this in a forward-looking way, because it might set the course for years to come. He also argued that almost all developed countries had been underinvesting over the years in public goods, the kinds of things that society needs, that people needs, and that basically developed countries need to raise their game. They need to increase public investments and also encourage private investments in sustainability, education with a focus on lifelong learning, and especially relevant for us today, digitalization. Now, another session yesterday also had some very complimentary content. European Commission Executive Vice President Timmermans provided a real call to arms for investment in sustainability, but the same arguments apply equally to digitalization. He argued that the investments that we're making to deal with the pandemic are effectively borrowing from the next generation, and that if we use them only to rebuild what we have, we're doing a disservice to the next generation. We really need to raise our game and broaden our horizon as to where we want to set our sights. I should also add that Tharman, in his remarks, noted that we have to deal with these challenges, again, in a climate where multilateralism is no longer the flavor of the month. That implies challenges for his country. It also implies huge challenges for Europe. So that's context for the questions that I've posed to our speakers today. I've asked them to look at things in that context. And first, is there a tension between recovering from the pandemic and the necessary investments in digitalization? Or are the investments complementary? Is digitalization part of the way that we recover from the pandemic? Can we do both at the same time? Secondly, Europe makes huge use of a wide range of digital technologies. In most of them, Europe is a heavy user, but not the leading producer. Is that something that we need to fix? And if so, what can we do to improve our role in producing technologies like artificial intelligence, big data, Internet of Things, 5G and 6G, and more? Do we need to focus more on training experts in these fields? And in particular, do we need to focus more on retaining the experts that we've trained? A third set of questions relates to platforms and the growing global challenges that we face. What can be done to strengthen the competitiveness of EU industries versus one another and in competition with our global trading partners and competitors? What role should competition policy, state aid rules, and taxation play in ensuring that we've got a suitably level playing field versus those competitors? what can be done about illegal content, fake news, and election manipulation, and how do we reconcile that with the need for freedom of expression? The fourth challenge that I raised has to do with the decline in multilateralism. What we're now seeing is aggressive trade policy, sometimes coupled with primary and secondary sanctions that carry enormous risk of disrupting supply chains for the digital goods and services that Europe relies on, including semiconductor technology. We're seeing that USA-China, not only in TikTok and WeChat, but also with Huawei. And we also see it in a different form relative to Nord Stream 2 and relative to our treaty with Iran. But those latter cases make clear these are things that can impact Europe as well. So again, what do we need to do about this? Do we need more diverse supply chains? Do we need more self-sufficiency? Can we achieve that across the board, or do we need to focus on specific areas? Now, to discuss all of those aspects, and there's a lot there, we have Gerard de Graaf, who's director of the Digital Single Market at the European Commission, DG Connect. He's responsible for a lot of the aspects that we're going to be talking about. We have Francesca Bria, who is the president of the Italian Innovation Fund. She's also a former chief technology officer for the city of Barcelona, very experienced professional. We have Alberto Di Felice, who's director for infrastructure, privacy, and security at Digital Europe. He'll be providing something of an industry perspective. And last but not least, Yorios Petropolis, my colleague and friend, a research fellow at Bruegel, who's also spending a lot of time at MIT at present under a Curie Sklodowska Fellowship. Now, before I pass the floor to the speakers, a quick bit of housekeeping. We will be collecting questions which we'll be posing to the panelists after their opening statements. You can pose questions yourself by using Slido with the hashtag of #BAM20. You can also, if you see questions that you can like them. They raise toward the top of the list if lots of people like the same question. So with that, I'd like to pass the floor to Director de Graaf. So Gerard, what keeps you awake at night? Despite the pandemic, the Commission has been very active on all of these topics. What are your thoughts on this?
Thank you, Scott. Pleasure to be here, also with the colleague panelists and the audience. What keeps me awake at night? It was the heat the last couple of weeks that kept me awake at night. I have the luxury of really not worrying too much about work as I try to sleep. But of course, I think the issues and the questions that you posed are fundamental questions to the future of the European Union. So we need to spend as much time as possible and collectively, and I think that's also why it's good to have this webinar to find the right answers to these questions. Maybe just a few comments on digital, and I mean, it looks like a lot of it is now self-evident and obvious, but it wasn't before the crisis. I mean, digital has been playing a major role in finding solutions, cures, I mean, to manage the kind of hospital admissions, to allow doctors to take decisions about who should go to the intensive care units under strain. The European supercomputers have been running 24/7 to find drugs already available that could help address some of the symptoms I mean, through the molecules of COVID, with cleaning robots. I mean, the tracing app has been a lot discussed. So technology is also at the center of trying to find solution to the medical and societal issues posed by COVID. I mean, often you think, well, what if this would have happened like 10, 20 years ago? I mean, how would we have coped? I mean, I think if there's ever evidence of how important technology has become to our lives, to our societies and the economy, it's because our societies and economy, with all the disruptions, have continued to perform and to function. I mean, we're holding this webinar now like online. I mean, 10, 20 years ago, I mean, I think the economy would have come to a society to a grinding halt. But what COVID has also done is obviously laid bare our weaknesses. And I think that brings us to the questions that you put. I mean, I mean, if we had had like more health data spaces, which we are now working on very kind of hard to bring kind of data together, of course, fully consistent with the data protection rules, we would have been in a better situation. If we had better connectivity, we would have been in a better situation. If we had stronger EU ICT companies, we would have been less dependent on supply chains that certainly have been to some extent unreliable over the last 6 months. If we had more people with advanced digital skills, I mean, we would have been in a better position. So it has done, digital has kind of, I think the last 6 months have made a lot clear about how important digital is today, how important it will be, and even more in the future, and what our homework is, where we are still struggling, where the European Union needs to do a lot better. Well, maybe a couple of points which could be like pointers for the rest of the discussion. We need a lot more cooperation at the level of the European Union. No single member state can address these questions alone. I mean, there's a lot that member states can do, but there are certain things that no member state, not even the biggest one like Germany and France, can do on their own. This is where we need a true European response. I think in your introductory remarks, you mentioned kind of we've been underinvesting globally. The EU has been underinvesting even more than others globally. So that's a challenge. I mean, we don't have, why don't we have the best connectivity in the world, in Europe? We can. Why don't we have more digitized industry, public services, the best skilled population? Why don't we have more universities in the top 20, technical universities in the top 20 in the world? Why don't we have the fast growing startups in the world? Part of it is because we don't invest enough. I mean, there's not enough money going into the economy, into those infrastructures. So that needs to change. And that brings us then to like, well, okay, but of course the crisis has wiped off a lot of our GDP. We're kind of, there's a strain on our economy. How can we invest in these times? And I think that was your first question. Well, we have no choice. We must. And I think also during other sessions, I mean, we are not going to rebuild the same economy. That's kind of make sure that the economy that emerges and the society that emerges after COVID is a greener one and a more digital one. And let's also not forget, if we want to have a greener society and we want to address climate change, we're not going to succeed without digital. These things are not separate strands. The two kind of hang very closely together. And also digital, obviously itself uses a lot, consumes a lot of energy. So also there, we need to make ICT much greener. So that's the challenge. We have now an agreement in the European Council on the Recovery and Resilience Fund. There is money available, 750 billion, large share of it in the form of grants. So that money will now need to be invested very quickly into these two priorities. And so, and that's kind of, I think, where we now need to work with the member states, and this needs member states kind of improving their connectivity, which is also critical for the single market. And we always think like it's rules in the single market. But if we have very diverse kind of levels of connectivity in the single market, very diverse kind of levels of like e-government, public administration, digital skills, digitized industry with supply chains that are European, the single market cannot work. The single market cannot work as well as it should. So those are things which we need to do. And then part of the recovery fund needs to be invested in collective projects. We need big projects, we need big investments in supercomputing, in AI, in cybersecurity, etc. I can develop that a little bit more, but I conclude a bit here. I think you referred to it, to the Digital Services Act, to the legislation. And some people said, well, I mean, is that really now as urgent? I mean, all the commission, when the commission came in and came with the digital strategy, that's all pre-COVID. So is that still relevant? I mean, all these regulations. Well, the answer is it's probably even more relevant than it was before COVID. Because if you look at digital and you look at like the European landscape and industry, and you ask yourself the question, well, why aren't there more successful ICT internet companies in Europe of really scale? And we haven't got many. I mean, Spotify, a few others. The answer is because it's just tremendously difficult in Europe to scale up. If you are successful in the Netherlands or in Belgium or Germany, you go cross-border, different rules. You start up again. You go to Poland, different rules. You start up again. In Europe, you have to start up like 27 times. That takes far too long. It's far too costly. The internet is all about speed and scale. So that's the reason. So we need to go very simply with the digital single market, one rule. And that's where, for example, the Digital Services Act fits in very well. We need to make it easy for companies to grow. And at the same time, make sure that we have the right level of protection so that people can trust technology, that they feel that the internet is safe, and that the platforms, in this case, they take greater responsibility. They act more than they do today. So that's what's at stake, and there's no simple answer, and it all has to be done together in cooperation, and we have to invest, we have to develop policy, we need to cooperate more, and we need a regulatory framework which is the best in the world. That's what we need.
Only that. That's a lot,
Please.
Gerard. That's a lot, Gerard. Thank you very much for these thoughtful comments. With that, I'd like to pass to Francesca Bria. Francesca is more or less the innovation expert on the panel, but you're also an expert on investment. So I would really welcome any response you have to some of the points that Director de Graaf made in that area, public versus private investment. A general problem that we have in Europe is that we tend to be bank heavy and equity light. We have far less venture capital in the US. Also that, it's difficult to do initial offerings, IPOs, and it also doesn't help that we have in many of the member states onerous rules on bankruptcies. So, I think you deal with all these issues. Perhaps you can touch on that in connection with your other remarks.
Yes, it's great to be here, first of all, and thanks, Scott. I also, as Gerard said, well, first of all, obviously, I will touch upon the question of greater cooperation in Europe and investment. And I also want to make some overall comments. And as Gerard already said, I think that the COVID-19 crisis, although is having a devastating impact around the world, at the same time, it gives us a historic opportunity to lay the foundation for a renewal of Europe, which is projecting us into a digital future that is carbon neutral. And today, I think that addressing Europe's twin challenges of the environmental protection and digitization can be done by harnessing European technological sovereignty to accelerate the ecological transition. And during the pandemic, we really saw a sort of forced digitization of many aspects of our life. And digital infrastructures like broadband connectivity and data have proved to be critical infrastructure on which essential services of society, such as work, healthcare, food delivery, and education depend upon. However, I think that accelerating digitization is not enough because we need to give it a clear direction. And in my perspective, as also was already said, we should use the post-pandemic phase and the recovery fund to advance with strength a new European model for digital sovereignty that we should call a digital Green New Deal, because it is about using digital technologies to attain both social and environmental sustainability. And I think that to get there, we should also be aware of the long-term political and social challenges that we're facing, and there are many. I will touch upon 4, and then I will look at some of Europe's key action to put forward. And I hope this can inform a little bit our discussion later. The first challenge, as you already mentioned in the introduction, is the new geopolitical dimension. And we are in a context of growing geopolitical multipolarity. And I think that European leadership is increasingly important now that the so-called tech Cold War between the US and China, which center on technological supremacy, from race to 5G, quantum computing, next generation chips, and artificial intelligence, risk creating a global technology industry split. And the tech global order, as we know, has come into question. An era of tech nationalism is emerging, and I think that an actual artificial intelligence arms race may be inevitable. In this context, we are increasingly seeing strong intervention from the US and Chinese government, tech bans, sanctions, attacks on global supply chains, export control, that is due on one side to national security concern, but also first economic competition to capture the immense value of the current digital industrial revolution. And we should predict that the US and China decoupling in the strategic technology sectors, which is already disrupting the flow of technology, talent, and investment between these two countries, will move into a broader array of economic activity. And one important objective, I think, for Europe here is to stay competitive in the strategic value chains of the future, such as electric batteries, renewable energy equipment, hydrogen fuel technologies that are needed to meet Europe's target, which is the key central target of becoming climate neutral by 2050. And Europe here can suffer from critical raw materials shortages due to over-reliance on imports. This means that Europe must also plan to reshoring in the critical value chains of the future to recreate European capabilities and get back well-paid jobs. Europe, as was also mentioned by Gerard, doesn't have companies that can compete in the platform-driven digitization, since all critical national infrastructure from hardware, software, and data flow are built outside the Union. And this can represent a big risk for growth in the long run, for Europe employment, and also influencing key sectors. And this brings me to the second challenge, which is the challenge of regulation, given the industrial concentration, which is unheard in recent history. So big tech aren't just driving the markets, they are the markets. If 5 companies own the digital economy, can it really work for all of us? For big tech, the pandemic is a shock, but unlike all of us, is a positive shock. While all other firms slowed down, tech firms sped up investments and acquisition. And the major digital players have achieved a combined stock market value of over $6 trillion US. And the US tech shares are now more valuable than the entire European stock market for first time on record. This means we need an antitrust policy shift to face unprecedented corporate monopoly power. It is also clear that to regulate the tech giants, there is a need for a new digital taxation system in which large companies pay taxes where they create profits without resorting to tax havens. And if this doesn't happen at the OECD level, the Commission, as stated by Commissioner Gentiloni, seems to be determined to move forward at a European level. The third challenge is an industrial challenge, because Europe cannot be seen only as a regulatory superpower anymore. The EU needs to remain relevant as a global economic power through its technological innovation rather than only regulation. And to be able to capture and share the economic value produced by digitization, we need a coordinated project of a new industrial strategy at a European level with a very ambitious and coordinated investment program. This was already mentioned by the Commission, and this means that we should be able to use Europe's recovery fund in alignment with Europe Green Deal and the digital strategy, where public and private investment should flow to grow the innovation ecosystem of Europe, which also means more investment in our startup and our talent, as well as environmentally friendly technologies to decarbonize the economy to be climate neutral in 2050, and critical technology areas such as 5G, the pan-European cloud computing, Gaia X, AI, next generation chips, and quantum computing. When it comes to critical digital infrastructures, I think one key focus should be reconquering the data sovereignty of our citizens, cities, and industries, developing a Europe-wide data space with new governance models, such as a European data trust. Data is the lifeblood of a modern economy, and an intelligent use of data is of great public interest. European cities' data is essential to tackle our big environmental social challenges like climate change, environmental sustainability, healthcare, education, sustainable mobility. And European governments should enforce rules for how their privacy-conscious citizen data is handled to avoid data being used by digital platforms to spy on, monitor, and manipulate their behavior. I've tried to do just that when I was a CTO in Barcelona for the past 4 years. turning municipal data into a public good co-owned by all citizens, and developing decentralized privacy-enhancing data infrastructures and redefining the smart city to serve its people. And finally, the democratic challenge, which in my opinion is the heart of everything, because many people have lost the sense of purpose in society, also because the foundations of democracy and public space are undermined at the root by a new form of algorithmic power that is gradually replacing the Habermasian public sphere, managed by the big digital giants. And in today's unequal digital society, power occurs to those who already have much of it, feeling popular discontent with the elites and giving rise to exponential growth of fake news, of conspiracy theory, hate speech, and racist attack online. This, we should be aware, has profound implications for the way that citizens relate to each other and to the state, and the existential fear of manipulation, information overload, inauthenticity created by the externality of the digital giants. It is clear that big tech alone are unable to handle the responsibility that come with all this power. So to end my talk, my remarks, I think that only by putting in place ambitious measures, both in the short term, but also in the long term with a strategic perspective, we will be able to break the binary logic that always presents us with two future scenarios for the digital. The first one is the big state, the China's top-down Orwellian model, which, while effective, could severely limit our constitutional rights. The other is the big tech Silicon Valley surveillance capitalism, as defined by Harvard Business School professor Zsuzsanna Zuboff, which places greater trust in big tech. This may also work, but in the long run, it will have detrimental effect on our democracy. And this other, the only option, I advocate for a third way between the big state, big tech, and the US-China wall, which is a big democracy, a democratization of data, citizen participation, and technology at the service of society. And if we fail to regain digital sovereignty, we risk of becoming a colony trapped between Beijing and Washington. So it is now the time of proposing a new model, which is a European technological sovereignty model that is a digital humanism. And this means technology at the service of society. Sorry, I'm having a little bit problem here. Okay, so the European solution that we should offer to the world should not retreat to a Cold War mentality. Instead, the new meaning of a global digital interconnected society with democratically agreed on oversight is needed, setting wide world standard for sustainable and democratic digitization that will benefit both people and the environment. I think this is the big challenge that Europe is facing, and I think this is the vision of a technological sovereignty which is really sustainable and has people at the very center. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was truly a call to arms. As far as digital Green Deal and big democracy, I hope you've trademarked those because I certainly intend to use them. Well done. Okay, now with that, I'd like to hand off to our next speaker, Alberto Di Felice. And Alberto, maybe you can give us an international business perspective on some of the same issues. Over to you, Alberto. You there?
Thanks a lot, Scott. Can you hear me? Beautiful.
Yes.
Very happy to be on this panel. I'm also happy to be physically here at the Bruegel office, or rather studio, even though not physically with you and my fellow speakers. I would like to thank you for the very nice introduction and the background that you laid out for us about this panel. As usual, very apt and comprehensive to stimulate the discussion. As I look through the description of the panel, I can't help but think that effectively we're looking, like you yourself said, at issues that have been more or less dormant and at times very vocally expressed in Europe for quite some time. So we're not looking at a new scenario that's been generated by the COVID pandemic. If anything, we're looking at a scenario that has been exacerbated by the pandemic, and will force us to respond much more precisely about what we want to do to respond, and also it forces us to do so at a time of increased uncertainty, so doubly difficult. So I think effectively this sums up the discussions about digital technological sovereignty and open strategic autonomy, which I think are the new names for describing Europe's role in the world. But I do think those are the same issues. I think it was Eric Hobsbawm, the famous historian, who said that unless the facts themselves change, no amount of changing name changes them. And I think this is an example of that. I think if I wanted to recommend a reading that sort of describes the situation for the average tech user, I would go back to a paper that was written by Anissa actually last year in July, before the new commission came in, and that Anissa consulted on about the ICT industrial strategy for Europe. It's not the most academically well-researched piece of work, but I think it's a fairly good overview of the concerns around sovereignty that we've seen in Europe for quite some time. And I was always struck by the very first page of that report that describes the situation of Europe being sandwiched between the US and Asia, and the situation of danger that creates for Europe's autonomy. And there was this very nice illustration of the burger, meaning, I think, the world, and the two halves of the burger are South Korea and China, the top half, and the bottom is the US. And in the center you have clearly the patty, and that's Europe. What I think that description fails to recognize is that I think people are supposed to eat the entire burger, aren't they? And arguably, if it's a good burger, the patty is actually the most succulent part. So I think the questions, as I can reformulate them, are rather, what do we need to do to make sure that Europe is a succulent patty and can contribute to a succulent burger overall for the consumer that wants to eat it, be the consumer European, American, or Chinese, or South Korean. And I think, a lot of the fundamental questions really go back to what Director de Graaf described. I mean, we do face fundamental issues around investment. And this is where I think the first question that you ask about the tension between the recovery and the pandemic, to me, shows a trade-off that we are facing now, because on the investment front, we already found it difficult to find sufficient funds to address the many priorities that we have. I think that the current commission was very visionary in how it proposed the new multi-annual financial framework. It allotted many more funds compared to the previous term to digital. But again, what we've seen in the discussions in the Council in July in the agreement, and now we'll go into the discussions with the Parliament, is that effectively, if you see the MFF versus the Recovery Fund is one. All the digital parts of the MFF have been cut, and we see more loans as opposed to grants. So I think the digital part has suffered, because we also need to consider the recovery efforts, and there is a trade-off there. So this poses fundamental questions as to how we invest that money, which to me means that we need to be wiser in how we invest it, both in what we identify as priorities for investment, and how we try to coordinate investment between the European funds and the funds that will be allotted nationally, so that we don't spend money in very small pockets that ultimately don't contribute to a unified sort of set of efforts. And these will be fundamental questions, because there's not a whole lot of money, and if we want to talk about the big words, sovereignty, autonomy, I think we need to put our money where our mouth is, and we need to make sure that the money is sufficient. And we again chronically face the questions around the role of competition policy, and should I add regulation in generating competition and competitiveness. And I think the next speaker will expand on this, Georgios, but I think irrespective of what one's opinion is about the new competition tool or the DSA, I think we need to keep in mind ultimately that, competition policy and regulation are not the same thing as industrial policy. We're facing, I think, with these issues, fundamental industrial policy questions that cannot be solved unilaterally through other means. Other means like competition policy can, right some wrongs, recreate competitive conditions on the market if competition is lacking. Regulation can fix some wrongs or lay down ground rules that we think as a society are practical and acceptable and that we want to promote. But they cannot create, the next startup unilaterally. You need other things for that. And, this goes back to another of Director de Graaf's points about skills. I mean, there's a lot that Europe, I think, could do in collaboration with the member states to increase the skills base and do other things like increasing collaboration between academia and business. Director de Graaf also clearly mentioned the ultimate goal of completing the digital single market. This is still one thing that we tend to underestimate. We tend to forget the complexity of a market such as Europe. And Scott, that the U.S. is a contrary to what we think is also a very complex market, particularly from a legal standpoint that the companies have to comply with. But I think we have to be smarter probably than the U.S. because we have other issues that the U.S. doesn't have, the many languages that we have, the different cultures that we have, and clearly the different legal regimes that we have on top of that. So that probably requires us to be smarter in how we go about doing that, and it's not an easy task at all. And then clearly there's the issue of what we do with the money, provided we get sufficient funds. And this is one fundamental question where I think the discussions about sovereignty and autonomy still tend to be painstakingly binary. I think there's a good discussion about autonomy that talks about the fundamental skills and capacities that you need to have to be a responsible, democratic society and democracy. And there's also the other side of the equation that, purely thinks of the other in the equation. So purely thinks of, the development in the tech world that it's happened in the U.S. and China, and purely tries to describe it, as evil in a sense, and tries to create capacity in Europe, but not as new capacity, but simply replacing external capacity, which, if I go back to the foundations of economic theory from my university days, is not necessarily the best way to generate wealth overall. So I think we need to figure out where we sit in the global value chain and where we need to invest. It's very unlikely that we'll be able to replace everything. One example being the discussion about manufacturing and putting manufacturing back in Europe. The same discussion is happening in the U.S. I think there's a clear drive in bringing back some tech manufacturing to the U.S., but that's only because there hasn't really been much tech manufacturing in the U.S. as of late. So that's probably an indication that it's not a measure of success in and of itself. But on the other hand, we do have some more traditional manufacturing in Europe that we're very strong in. Digital transformation of traditional industries, the IoT transformation, these are probably areas where we do have a competitive advantage already, and so we need to tap into that into that part of the market where we do have quite a lot of strengths, and where probably we also have quite interesting parallels with other economies such as Japan, for instance, which are not usually part of these discussions. So I'll probably stop at that and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you very much for that. Again, a very thoughtful contribution. And without losing any time, I'd like to move to Yorios. The clock is ticking and we can't run over. So with that, we need to keep it moving. Thank you, Yorios. Over to you. You get to bat cleanup. Go forth.
Thanks a lot, Scott. I think this pandemic crisis, as all speakers mentioned, showed that investment in digital infrastructure as well in digital skills can accelerate recovery, the path of Europe for the recovery. We have seen that the digital dimensions can be really important, and especially given that we are still under uncertainty about for how long this crisis, this pandemic will continue influencing our daily lives and work. This, of course, will have a differential impact on different sectors, depending on to the extent they are relying on digital channels. And this should be taken into account and requires an extra coordination on the investment strategy that Europe will adopt for the recovery. But a key point that will play for sure a role is your observation, your second point during the interaction, that when we are talking about digital technology, clearly Europe is lagging behind, is not the leader in the production of these technologies. And this can be attributed to many factors. The most of them have already been mentioned, like the difficulties of European firms to scale up. However, when we take this observation in the current geopolitical situation we live, we see, first of all, the skepticism towards globalization, which also is motivated by the US-China relationship and how the geopolitical stress is evolved there. So this clearly affects the European aspects on the debate. And lately, we have seen also ideas that promoting a strategy of protectionism by either imposing constraints in the entry and operation or operation of some digital firms to provide a room for growth for European competitors, or even to bend competition rules to allow, for example, market consolidations between European firms so that they can grow in this way, even if these measures by EU competition law is found anti-competitive, to be more effective competitors in the global scale. By having this approach of protectionism, we basically some problems, we principally have some problems, and this is the reason I don't agree with this approach. The first one is that this approach is not consumer-centered. If some firms provide high-quality products and efficient services, then they should be allowed without constraints to operate in the European market, no matter if they are coming from China or the US. Of course, when you are talking about security issues, security standards should be high, and we should not have discounts there for any reasons. But I believe that it is much more promising for European firms to grow, to follow a market efficiency approach. We should not reduce the value created in digital markets. Interventions should retain this value. But what we should do is to provide rules so that this value is redistributed in a better way towards local actors and the European ecosystem. And let me explain that. The fundamental unit of the digital ecosystem, as it was already mentioned by Francesca, is data. Data is of particular importance and creates value because it includes vital information which firms, through algorithmic processing, translate into knowledge, which is essential to improve the efficiency of their services. So having access to this information can lead to better ideas for digital applications, can lead to attraction of talent, attraction of financing, and eventually can lead to market expansion and firm growth. So given that digital ecosystems, and in particular big platform ecosystems, are seen to be markets with great information asymmetries, I think a key objective should be to design a regulatory framework that transmits such vital information across the digital ecosystem and gives equal opportunities to European firms to improve their efficiency and scale up. And that in turn can lead to a more diverse supply chain in the digital sector. It can also provide some self-efficiency. This is what I would say approaches the digital sovereignty, is the ability to control the information provided in the European market in the digital ecosystem, to control it and to redistribute it in a way that provides more benefits to European actors. There are some regulations that they are already in place. For example, in the banking sector, we have the Payment Service Directive 2. We have in UK the Open Banking Program. GDPR provides data portability rights for data transfers. So we can think for ways on how we can redistribute this information, but for sure we need regulation for this that takes into account the technical compatibilities needed for that information sharing, but also that allows the continuity of data sharing. Having said that, this information sharing will also be beneficial for the authorities. I mean, we discuss about competition policy, but many of the cases have to do with new markets, which authorities have limited knowledge. There is this asymmetric information problem when we evaluate such cases. So such information sharing can allow authorities to get a better understanding of how this market works and make less mistakes in the process of evaluating anti-competitive strategies. Now, if we have such a regulatory framework of transparency and information sharing, competition policy can work more effectively. And I would like to propose in this dimension something that has been proposed for the UK, and we see that there are some initiatives towards this direction, to adopt a code of conduct that provides transparency over what strategies may be problematic, anti-competitive, and under which conditions. That, of course, should rely on the specific business model in place and may take different form, this code of conduct, as we move to different models in the online ecosystem. But that will help to accelerate the evaluation of cases and provide more transparency also for firms, so they know how to behave in the online ecosystem. Having said that, there was also the point about industrial policy and competition policy that was very nicely put by Felipe. I would like to say, and close with that industrial policy, investment coordinated strategies can work the best when we have competitive markets with clear, transparent rules, when we have trust in online ecosystem with strong privacy right. So industrial policy should be it's something to build on such an ecosystem in order to have greater returns for Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Yorios. Thank you once again for some very, very thoughtful remarks. I would dearly have loved to have had a debate among the panelists, but the clock is ticking, and I don't want to lose any chance for us to hear from the audience. So I'll toss out one question, and I'd suggest we take this one in reverse order from that which we started, assuming that each of you have something to say. A question from Ignacy Swicicki is it possible for Europe to set global standards in technology in the future if there are no globally leading tech companies from Europe? What impact would we have? And I think I'd broaden this a bit beyond the standards. What impact do we have on the technology scene in general if we don't have enough leading companies? Assuming everyone has something to say on that, Yorios, do you want to go first?
Yes. I believe that Europe has already shown its ability to set global standards. And I will refer to two examples. Despite the fact that we don't have leading European firms, the GDPR set a privacy standard which is quite influential, and it is discussed all over the world. A second example is the standard in theories of harm in competition policy. Again, we see that Brussels, with the analysis of competition policy cases in digital firms, initiated a new era of discussions of whether we and how we should regulate platforms, how we can make more transparent the online ecosystem and the platform ecosystem. So we see again that when there is a strong will to move forward, we can be quite influential also in other parts of the world, even if we lack the scaling in our European firms.
Thank you. Alberto?
Yeah, well, I think fundamentally Europe is and remains and will remain for the foreseeable future the largest market in the Western world. That in and of itself gives it huge power to set the rules of the game, which is another thing that I've always found unclear about the fact that now all of a sudden we seem to be setting rules that everybody seems to follow. We've always set rules that everybody has had to follow if they want to do business in Europe. So that has always been the case, and we have a very strong system for especially the technical aspects of the single market. That will only continue. And then I can only mention again the GDPR example as one example that has generated a culture of compliance for global businesses that I think has percolated to some extent globally through their operations, irrespective of the legal changes that we're seeing now, for example, in some U.S. states. So definitely, just the fact that we can leverage the rules of the internal market, I think, can set the rules for a large portion of the global market.
Francesca?
Yeah, I would say that I think that in order for Europe to keep having this role, which I agree, in fact, Europe is seen as this kind of regulatory superpower, but also setting standards. And I think the standards, as I tried to say, have to be on the question of linking much more sustainability and digitization, and of course do that in a democratic way. So yes, building on GDPR and some of the kind of leading privacy standard, but also data interoperability, data portability, and data sovereignty. It gives Europe the possibility to build a platform on top of which develop a digital society that will really benefit people. And also this means that we need to understand that the digital society is linked to healthcare, mobility, education, climate change. So it's not only a technology problem, it's a problem for, our economy in a large scale, and also our political capacity to really set the rules. So I would really agree with the question in a sense that I think if we do not develop an industrial policy in a sense of having our own technology firms investing in AI, 5G, next generation chips, our cloud infrastructure on top of which building the European data trust, we need that in order to be also able to enforce these great juridical rules and these great frameworks and these standards that we have. I mean, this worked in the past with Airbus, with our telephone system, the 4G. I mean, Europe have been setting the standards, but also creating an industry. And this gives us the possibility to then have a European innovation ecosystem for also our startups and our talent, and create better jobs and our society to grow. So I think the two things are very interrelated. And this shows it shows in the new European Commission, I think, policy lines.
Thank you very much. And over to you, Gerard. How do we maintain our influence internationally in areas like standards?
Thank you, Scott. I mean, three remarks. I think first, I want to avoid the impression that somehow like the European Union is nowhere in advanced technologies. I mean, we are strong in 5G. We will be strong in 6G. We are, I think some panelists said, Alberto said we're strong in IoT. We're world leading in IoT. We have a pretty impressive microelectronics industry with their own specific kind of expertise, particularly low power processing, which is extremely important also for the climate and for environmental sustainability. In robotics, we're strong. I mean, we are strong in quantum, which is coming. I mean, so we have the capacity. It's not that kind of the European Union is way behind everybody else, but we have a challenge. And so in those areas where we are strong, take IoT, the M2M standard, which was set also with the help of ETSI, is now the global standard. So indeed, it does help. If you have strong industries, you have a more ability to set also the global standards. I think the second point is that we should not be looking at the technology landscape as static or as kind of it's been set. I mean, where is technology going? I mean, the industrial internet, we're going into kind of, yes, we are behind. And we talk about platforms and social media and marketplaces, the app store. Yes, that's where Europe is clearly nowhere. But in the kind of, for the future, which is actually today, areas like health, like fintech, industrial applications, agriculture, very important sector. I mean, the European Union can lead and will be leading. And there's a lot of like technology companies, I mean, startups that can grow. I mean, look at fintech. This is actually an area where the European Union has got a regulatory landscape. I think George has referred to the PSD, the Payment Services Directive 2. I mean, where do you see a lot of kind of dynamism and vibrancy? Where is the European Union clearly ahead of the US and of other players? I mean, it's in fintech with some really dynamic players here. So that's the second point. The internet will be changing. Also, it will become more decentralized. We're looking at it now very much like all platforms, and they will be there forever. Well, blockchain technologies, the next generation internet has a different concept about where the internet will be moving, and it will be less centralized and much more decentralized and much more control for the individual. I think the third is more the regulatory side of it, and absolutely the GDPR is the world standard. What I like is that when we now talk about data, talk 5 years ago about data, 10 years ago about data, we would almost talk exclusively about the protection of personal data. Now we're talking about how can we exploit it, how can we share it, how can we extract value from it and use it for innovation. That's different. That's a different kind of message also coming out of Europe and coming out of the European Commission. Not say GDPR is less important, but to say, look, we also need to make sure that data benefits our economies and societies. What we're working on now, and the DSA will be the GDPR for the world. How do we regulate the platform economy? The Digital Services Act will set the world standard. What we're going to do on data, there's going to be a Data Governance Act coming in October. The Data Act coming next year is going to become a world standard. Third countries are going to look at, like, how is the European Union dealing with those really important issues? AI, artificial intelligence, the European Union, I mean, not the first 100 days as we know, but there's still a regulatory initiative in the works for early next year. There's been a lot of work done with high-level groups. Principles have been set. That's going to be the world standard. At least that's if you want to do business in the European Union in this big single market. Well, you better comply with these principles, which are instilled, which are embedded in what I think Francesca quite eloquently presented as like our European model. I mean, our democracy. I mean, how we want kind of, our citizens and our societies to be protected. Cybersecurity, the same thing. So the European Union will remain the lead rule setter across the world. You would expect me to say that because I work for the rule setter, so the European Commission, but I think it will happen. But also in other areas, I think we have leading technologies, but we need more. And in some areas, I mean, where the internet is going, industrial internet in particular, I mean, that's where the European industry is strong. There will be innovations, there will be technical solutions developed that obviously will give us a strong influence on the standards that will subsequently emerge.
Thank you so much, Gerard, for once again a very, very thoughtful intervention. I completely agree that we often overlook the areas where Europe is strong, and there's a lot of them, in fact. And I think all of these points are really well taken. Well, I hate to say it, we can't run any further over because the next panel starts right after this one. Since the audience can't applaud you, I'll take the opportunity to do it myself and invite you to do the same. Really well done. And thank you very, very much for that. Thanks to the audience for sticking with us. And I'd like to invite the audience to catch the next panel, which starts right now. It's going to be chaired by my Bruegel colleague, Jean Pisani-Ferry, and it's on geopolitics and the economy. And with that, once again, many thanks, and I'm bringing this panel to a close.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.